The following podcast was taken from a webinar presented by Dr. John Lucey from the University of Wisconsin, titled The Future of Milk Protein as a Functional Food. To view the full webinar and access the slides referenced during this podcast, visit balchem.com/real-science and use the search bar to jump to this webinar from May 26th of 2020.
The economics of feeding ReaShure precision-release choline. ReaShure is fed during the transition period, and because it's fed for such a short period of time, it costs just $15 per cow, and yet the benefits will continue to generate income throughout the year. Cows fed ReaShure produce 5 pounds more colostrum, which pays for your ReaShure investment on the very first day of lactation. Cows fed ReaShure also produce 5 pounds more milk per day, every day. That means after the first day, every day is payday. Invest in ReaShure during the transition period and recoup your investment on the very first day of lactation. After that, you got it, payday.
So the things I want to cover this morning are an introduction to milk proteins and give you a background to it. And then talk a little bit about, after talking about milk proteins, talk about milk protein ingredients, because what we've seen over the last, especially over the last 30 years, is rather than the dairy industry focus on producing cheese, yogurt, fluid milk, they have moved to producing highly concentrated versions of milk proteins. And those proteins, either in their original form or their modified form, are now massive ingredients that are sold around the world. So I want to talk about how those are produced and also talk about their uses and application. What drives the popularity of these proteins and why have we seen such a surge in their production and uses? I'm going to focus on 2 topics that have shown key growth in the last, especially in the last 15 to 20 years. And I think you'll see more growth in this area. And then as we're on the topic of interesting milk proteins, I want to talk about A2 milk and what kind of proteins they are. And then there's a lot of talk about, are they better for you or different and so on. So I want to talk briefly towards the end about what A2 milk is and what's the evidence. And then we'll wrap up with some conclusions. So let's take a little step back and do a little bit of an introduction to talk a little bit about what we're talking about when we mention milk proteins. Up till about 1920, there was really a thought that in milk, there was really only one protein, and those were called caseins, and they were related to the terminology around curds and whey. The caseins were thought to be the curd, the stuff that you formed a gel or a curd when you fermented milk. So you can hear little Miss Muffet is eating her curds, and the whey was considered a liquid. After a while, they figured out obviously there was some sugar in it, mostly lactose. And until about 1920, they really didn't figure out that there was multiple caseins, and there actually was some protein in this whey or this liquid as well. For cow's milk, those ratio between those 2 caseins and whey proteins are about 80% casein and about 20% in the serum phase. That ratio depends on the species of animal or mammal that we're talking about. In humans, that ratio is about 40% caseins and 60% whey protein. So this number is changed depending on the needs of the milk and the nutritional requirements that it has for the young. When we look at the different types of caseins, there are 3 major types, at least in cow's milk or bovine milk. There's what we call alpha-S-caseins, beta-casein, and Kappa-casein. They have these funny Greek symbols and letters, mainly because of the terminology and technology that was used originally to separate the caseins. As I said, back in around the 1920s, they still thought there was just one protein called caseins. But as they started to develop some separation technologies like chromatography and electrophoresis, they started to see multiple bands could be separated from that one original casein band. And that started to give those letters different different caseins, different Greek symbols to represent which bands they could see under electrophoresis. So that's the reason why we have these Greek symbols here. The alpha S means sensitive to calcium. The alpha-S caseins were found to be very quickly, if they put them into solutions of calcium, they were very quickly precipitate. One of the reasons we found out later is that they're very rich in phosphate. And that's part of the overall master plan for the caseins. They are really our calcium binding proteins. And that's their role in life. Because for the milk of the mammal, and we're talking here about cow, she really wants to deliver to the young lots of protein, high quality protein, we'll talk about that coming up, but also she wants to deliver lots of calcium and phosphate for bone development. And that is very important for the young. So she has to find some way to deliver that calcium into the milk. And she does it by making the caseins highly phosphorylated, and phosphate binds the calcium, and then it delivers it in the milk to the young. One thing about the alpha-S caseins is they're not present in human milk. So some of these caseins can be interchangeably have the purpose of doing, for example, calcium binding or delivery of calcium. They don't necessarily have to be there. The alpha caseins also precipitate readily with acid and are part of the network that makes things like yogurt. If we look at the middle column here, beta-caseins, they're less quantity in cow's milk than the alpha-S caseins. They are rich, but not as rich as the alpha-S caseins, so they have less phosphorylation onto the amino acid chain. There are two main genetic variants, but there are other genetic variants, and we'll come back to that when we talk about A1 and A2. And it's a controversial topic, but right now, there's no real solid evidence that the A2 genetic variant is healthier, and I'll talk about that towards the end of it. The Kappa-casein is very important casein. Without the Kappa-casein, there wouldn't be the casein structures in milk, and it wouldn't be able to deliver this high amount of calcium and phosphate for bone development. It plays a very important protective role in forming structures that can stay suspended within the milk. That protein, this Kappa-casein, is actually the target for the rennet enzyme that's used to actually make and start the cheese making process. It specifically goes in, hydrolyzes, chops up that protein, and because it loses its stabilizing ability, we very quickly get a clot. The topic around the structures of these casein particles has been a major area of interest for the last 50 plus years. One of the reasons, and you see a couple of electron micrographs here on the screen in both the bottom left-hand corner and the top right-hand corner, is that when you image the casein structures using things like electron microscopy, there really isn't the nice three-dimensional kind of models that we're used to seeing for proteins and enzymes with things like alpha helixes and so on. They tend to be large. You can see here that with the scale bar on the bottom left-hand one, that they can be over 100 nanometers. Putting that in context, many of the globular proteins that we'll see, the whey proteins, are going to be 2 to 3 nanometers. So they can be more than 50 times and even much bigger than that relative to the whey proteins. So huge aggregates is what they are. And this is just one example of a model here that I'm showing here from Dr. David Horn out of the Hanna Institute. And scientists have tried to figure out how did they form these massive aggregates that contain thousands of caseins. And there's also a very important role for what are shown here as the triangles, the CCP, which is the calcium phosphate that's buried within the casein particles. These structures were developed to do two things. The first is to deliver lots of the calcium and phosphate buried within the protein structure, and then make sure that it stayed stable within the mammary gland of the cow. We've all probably heard of things like kidney stones, which are very painful. And what they are precipitates of calcium and salts that can form within the body. and then they precipitate out within the body, and then they're very difficult to remove. We don't really want the cow to have kidney stones in the milk. So having these calcium and phosphate precipitate and form small crystalline type materials within the proteins is a safe packaging mechanism to make sure that it doesn't happen to the cow and block up the mammary gland structures and allows it to be delivered to the young. Once this casein micelles enters the gut and is consumed by the calf, these calcium and phosphates are dissolved by low pHs and start to be absorbed into the protein. So it's a really smart and safe packaging mechanism to put it inside these casein particles. Let's move on to the whey proteins. The type of whey proteins present in the different milks, the different species milks, varies. In cow's milk, about 50% of all the whey proteins is a protein called beta-lactoglobulin. It has very excellent nutritional properties, but it's actually not present in human milk. So therefore, it must have an interchangeable function depending on which mammal needs different types of milks. It's also a target for allergy research because obviously it's not present in human milk. Anything that isn't present in human milk becomes an object or a protein of interest to see if it causes allergic reaction in some children. Alpha-lactalbumin, on the other hand, is in every milk. Why? Because it's a cofactor or a modifier for the production of lactose. Lactose is the sugar found in every milk of every mammal, and it's the only real source that you can find that sugar. And that's actually because the alpha-lactalbumin modifies the enzyme pathway and makes sure that enzyme pathway now produces lactose. So lactose and alpha-lactalbumin go together. So if we start and look at the caseins in whey proteins, and I tried to make a little list here of 9 specific topics when you're comparing the caseins and whey proteins, it's like a yin and a yang. They're both completely different and almost every major characteristic. I'll go through briefly some of those differences, but they really are completely different types of proteins. They're in completely different classes of proteins. But by having both of them in milk, we probably maximize both the benefits and the properties and the nutrition from having both of them present. For example, number 1, the caseins are what are called in biochemical parlance random coil. One of the reasons for that is they have a huge high proline content, which disrupts ordered structures. So in one layman's language, you might say it's already denatured before you start. For whey proteins, they have these beautiful structures that I show you on the last slide with lovely alpha helixes and so on. They have very low proline content. Caseins have sulfur, but not a lot of their key caseins have sulfur amino acids. But whey proteins are rich in sulfur amino acids. So on that benchmark, you can say that they are a little bit better nutritionally than the caseins. A topic I'll come back to when we talk about nutrition is that caseins have a normal amount of branched chain amino acids. Branched chain amino acids are things like leucine and isoleucine, which are getting a lot of attention from muscle synthesis and other aspects. Whey proteins have the highest natural source found in any protein. We already mentioned that the caseins are phosphorylated. That's done on purpose. That's a post-translational modification of serines, and it's done on purpose within the mammary cells to make sure that the caseins become calcium-binding proteins. The whey proteins are not phosphorylated. That's not their function. We already saw some pictures of the caseins. They're huge colloidal suspensions. We call them casein micelles, but they're not true micelles like surfactant micelles. Whey proteins are small, soluble proteins, like most other proteins we come across. Caseins, when you put them, when they're consumed and they go into your stomach, they actually clot pretty easily within the stomach. And then they start to digest. Whey proteins don't get really digested in the stomach, but mostly as you pass down through the small intestine. And there they start to get rapidly digested. Caseins are soluble at neutral pH. Think of milk. It's not a clot until it goes sour. So at the natural, neutral-like pH of milk, caseins are very soluble. Whey proteins are soluble over a very broad pH range when they're native. What I mean by that is if you heat them, they lose this ability and also start to clot. Caseins are stable to heat. Think about some of the canned and retorted milks that are out there, or sterilized milks that may be available on the market. That's really weird because you think about other proteins like eggs and you boil them for a few minutes and they clot. That's the same for whey proteins. They're readily denatured by heat. Because they have ordered structures during the heating, they lose these ordered structures and start to aggregate. Caseins have a very uneven distribution of different classes of amino acids, in particular the hydrophobic and hydrophilic amino acids. It makes it very surfactant-like and emulsifier-like, which very helpful for its functionality. Whereas whey proteins have a much more even, non-segregated or segmented types of distribution. And caseins haven't been crystallized or a non-globular protein, whereas whey proteins, all the major crystalline structures have been reported for whey proteins. So really very different properties, but they're both in milk and they both contribute to the properties of milk and milk products. If you look a little bit at the proteins in human and cow's milk, I just want to mention a couple of things here. Human milk has a much lower concentration of casein. The humans are obviously on a different type of, human babies are on a very different types of growth process compared to cows and calves. Calves are up walking around within minutes. That's not obviously true for human babies. Human milk also doesn't contain beta-lactoglobulin. We talked about that already. But you also see some of the very interesting differences for minor proteins, like lactoferrin is very high in human milk and exceptionally high in colostrum. Colostrum is the first milk that comes out right after birth. Lysozyme too. These have functions that are getting a lot of interest, for example, for antimicrobial and other types of stimulatory functions and protective functions for the young. Unfortunately, cow's milk, they're sacrificing more of the effort towards caseins to deliver calcium binding, good nutrition, etc., and less for these things like these lactoferrins and lysozymes, very protective. It's very much about what the nature of the young is. So let's move on. Beyond just consuming fluid milk, we can take a raw material, whether it's milk or whey, we can go through a process of concentrating it, and we can do the concentrating, that is removing water or removing some sugars and other dissolved materials. And we can do that by either evaporating it, which is either condensing it or boiling it under a vacuum, or we can use membranes to filter out some of the soluble components. That technology started to be worked on primarily in the 70s and really hit the big time in the 1980s, and it's become a $1 billion industry around the world. That produces a range of powders that you see down at the bottom here. These dried powders are either milk-based or they're whey-based. And they have words like milk protein concentrate. Then that means that we have, by this process, increased the protein content to maybe in the concentrate up to 80 or 85% protein. You can also go as high as an isolate, which is over 90% protein in the powder. It does that by removing most of the fat, most of the lactose, most of the other materials, because it wants to get such a high level of protein. And the same is true for the whey side, where you have whey protein concentrates and you have whey protein isolates. These are driving the growth and popularity of dairy ingredients for many of the applications that require high amounts of protein, and we'll talk about some of those coming up. I looked at the information brought out by some of our trade associations, ADPI and others, and they looked and do stats and surveys of what types of milk-based ingredients are produced every year. This is stats only for the US. So in 2018, the last available stats, there were about 3.5 billion pounds produced here in the US. About half was non-fat dry milk, and about another 16% was skim milk powder. These are very closely related materials with only minor differences in their properties depending on the protein content. So the bulk of what is produced here in the US is non-fat dry milk, skim milk, dried milk basically, without changing the protein content. But as you go to some of the minor ones over here, you can see that milk protein concentrates and milk protein isolates are about 4%, whole milk powder another 4%, and there's a wide range of buttermilk and other things. So what we're seeing is that although, yes, here in the US, the bulk of what we produce is still dried milk without concentrating the protein, there are these other types of milk proteins that are starting to become popular in the last number of years. So let me get back to my main topic. What's driving the popularity or the growth of dairy and likely to be also for the future popularity of these dairy proteins? I would say there's two main things. One is their versatility in many food applications, and we'll see some of those applications coming up. So they're very versatile, can go in lots of places and be very beneficial. And then I would say that excellent quality, high nutritional quality, and superior to almost every other protein. And where quality matters, that's where people are making the choice to put in dairy proteins. Taking one of those milk-based or casein-based ingredients, here are the numbers from 2018. And you can see nutrition is a huge segment of it. You can see close to half of the applications for milk protein concentrate are either sports beverages, which tend to be kind of nutrition-like, and mainstream nutritional products. So you can see nutrition in this instance is really driving the growth of milk protein concentrates. And these nutritional products are lots of different things, whether they're either drinks or recovery drinks or other kind of products. You can see that mainstream nutrition and sports beverages are really the king here in terms of the main applications for these milk protein concentrates. I looked at some of the reports that are coming out around milk protein concentrates, and this just gives you an idea, and this is a couple of years old. You can see what type of products that are going into, what kind of products are using these high protein milk-based ingredients. And the first thing I would say on this slide is there's a long list. There are many different types of applications that have been, or products that have been launched with these high protein things, and that gives you an idea that there has been and continues to be a lot of interest in protein fortified or increased protein products, whether that's energy bars, nutritional powders, drinks, yogurts. Oral feeding would be more for medical type of applications, cheese, and other kind of products. It's a broad range, and that's fueling its growth. And here's some examples driving down a little bit more of what exactly are some of those, whether it's desserts or sports nutrition. Dairy means used in other dairy products for fortifying, like processed cheese application, other kind of things, or Greek yogurt. And you can see bakery, soft drinks, confectionery, etc. It's a broad spectrum. Nutrition is heavily mentioned in here too. From the whey side, you also see a trend, especially for the whey protein isolate. That's the form that's over 90% in protein. So it's the highest protein version of it. You can see a trend towards things like sports bars and related nutritional products are very popular. Some of the trends change from year to year, but that has been the way things have been going in recent years for whey protein isolates, because you really have paying more because it's a higher protein product, but you're looking for applications that really need an isolate versus a concentrate. Scientists and industry have looked at various things over the years to not just accept what we get from the cow, but what can we do to either concentrate it, as I mentioned, or change the properties, like taking out some of the sugar or minerals or fat, or isolate some individual materials. For example, isolate the sugar, like lactose, the dairy minerals, or individual proteins. And we have commercial processes for isolating a number of the key, both caseins now are of interest, but also whey proteins like lactoferrin and alpha-lactalbumin, etc. And we can, of course, modify things too by looking at either hydrolyzing or enriching it or heat treating it as well. So scientists and industry are very creative and not just accepting what they get, but modifying it to suit some market applications. And what are some of these market applications? And these really, in most cases here, these market applications have really come along in the last 20, 30 years. You've got high protein products. We talked about nutrition and sports bars, etc., and drinks. We've been able to reduce the fat content of even existing whey protein concentrates for drinks and other kind of products for athletes. Hydrolyzed proteins, where you chop them up with enzymes, can go into more heat stable applications or bars that don't harden as fast, and so on. And there is interest in the enriching things like infant formula in one type of protein. For example, I mentioned earlier on that in cow's milk, we have a lot of beta-lactoglobulin as the whey protein, but that's not present in human milk. So we can tweak and modify the types of proteins that are present in cow's whey protein to make it more look like what we're present in humans. And they call that humanizing, and that's a process that's researched a lot. How can we, by processing techniques and separation techniques, deliver a protein profile that looks closer to infant formula? The idea that mother knows best, and can we tweak and modify the cows to look more like what breast milk looks like? I want to change gears a little bit here and talk a little bit about the concentration and nutritional aspects of milk proteins. And here's just some data looking at the nutritional quality of milk protein. And what I want to point out here is a couple of things. The first point I will make here is that some of the key essential amino acids are extremely high levels in milk proteins, whether that's just whey proteins or caseins. They both have extremely high levels of these. In fact, probably for some of these, we probably would say the whey proteins are slightly higher. And some of the other bars, this FAO, for example, is World Health Organization has organizations that look at the quality of proteins, particularly from an infant formula nutritional point of view. And what you can see here is from the BCAA is branched chain amino acids. And for things like branched chain amino acids and leucine and other key amino acids, dairy proteins, both of them are very, very high and excellent sources. Since the 1970s, a lot of exciting nutritional research started to look at leucine and other branched chain amino acids like isoleucine, valine, etc. And what they found when they looked at various available protein sources is that whey is the richest natural source of branched chain amino acids. And you can see here it's about over 26% of its protein is branched chain amino acids. And it's a very high concentration of leucine, higher than even eggs and soy and some of the other products as well. Why the focus on branched chain amino acids? The interesting nutritional research over the last 15 years, as I mentioned, have really focused heavily on these branched chain amino acids. And in fact, before the regular consumers were aware of branched chain amino acids, the weightlifters, bodybuilders, and really serious advocates for nutrition had already figured this out. And that's why you go often to these GNC stores or other kind of supplement stores, and you'll see them advertising, like in those cans here, 100% whey proteins, because they already had figured that out. Why? Because research has shown that high concentration of branched chain amino acids helps initiate protein synthesis, and also is very important for muscle recovery. More recently, there's been a lot of interest looking at weight loss and how it might affect blood glucose levels. And there's also very exciting research that talks about the synergies with exercise. And as we get older, we need actually a little bit more protein as we lose the benefits of the younger population have of hormones, etc., to help with muscle synthesis and protein recovery. And sarcopenia is a loss of muscle mass in aging, and it can help and be needed for those kind of aspects as well. So a lot of very exciting nutritional research focusing on branched chain amino acids. What's also clear is that taking protein makes you feel full. And there's a couple of different mechanisms by how that would possibly work. So this feeling of fullness carries forward in reducing the desire to have more snacking and more food and more calories. So it has a double benefit, both for affecting overall signaling within the body from having high concentration of branched chain amino acids, but also feeling fuller and not wanting to consume as many calories. And these are some of the reasons why you see the interest in high protein products not just become a quick fad, because there is a lot of solid science around the benefits of protein, especially these proteins that have these high branched chain amino acids and this leucine and its ability to signal and modify our metabolic processes. For example, some nutritionists propose that it's important to get high amounts of protein throughout the day, and propose that what we're talking about here is not just to have a large dinner with steak or something in the evening and getting a lot of protein there, as you see on the right hand part of it, but they talk about getting a balanced amount of protein throughout all meals, and that way you get maximum protein synthesis and get the maximum benefit of the high protein diet. In both cases on this graph, they're both getting about 90 grams of protein a day. In one case, it's getting it evenly, and the others, it's not. So I would say that this kind of research, in terms of the quality of importance of protein, but also the importance of things like leucine, which is a branched chain amino acid, is really part of why we see a lot of these milk proteins end up in these nutritional type products, whether it's drinks, bars, etc. If we step back a little bit again and look at where we're seeing these products go into, you can see, for example, lots of nutritional products, but also fortifying unusual products like mac and cheese, but it's because it's part of making the cheese product, and Velveeta as well. But you also see it in things like some of the ice cream products and the higher protein ice cream products that are coming out in the last couple of years. Isolate, which again is over 90% protein, see it in bars or even some pizza applications, shakes, and into some of modified infant formulas as well. Coming back to the weight management, in terms of focusing more on protein than on carbohydrates here, you can see a lot of different types of options here. And whether it's for the satiety, feel full, and then consume less, or whether it's for having an effect on protein synthesis and therefore affecting things like glucose and insulin resistance, etc., you can see a lot of different either drinks, bars, and shakes. And here's for muscle recovery. So after exercise, taking some products to recover, whether these are the professional athletes or us as regular people doing some exercise, there's a lot of these products that have come out over the last 15 years. Primarily, they've been made with whey protein, but not all of them. So that type of demand has fueled the production here in the US of milk protein concentrates. Starting from almost zero just over about 15 years ago, you can see an increased production here in the US steadily over that time. There are still imports of these products from around the world, but US production is increasing. And in fact, I believe in recent years, there's been actually a small amount of milk protein concentrates now exported. Where are those opportunities for these exports? Well, for example, China, you can hear this is a distribution of some of the types of products that they're importing. But in recent years, obviously, the US has had a problem with tariffs and trade wars, etc. But you can see that a lot of different opportunities for different dairy products were historically there before these recent issues. So in this phase of it, I want to pause there and say, in general, talking about milk protein, there has been a growth in higher protein products, less lactose, etc. And there's a very diverse uses for milk proteins in many different types of products. Researchers have developed many techniques, both in the lab that have been moved to factories to modify or improve their functionality and tweak it and make it more suitable for whether it's a bar or whether it's a drink, or whether it's a yogurt or some other kind of product. We see an increased focus on nutritional products, protein bars, weight management products, beverages, recovery drinks, infant foods, food for seniors, supplements, etc. And I believe that will continue to grow. Why? I think it's because of the high nutritional quality, and not everybody right now understands the quality of proteins and really thinks all proteins are the same. I think as more people understand things like the high amount of branched chain amino acids in dairy proteins, they will see that not all proteins are the same. Another emerging area is interest in individual proteins and separating out individual proteins and isolating them and selling them. For example, lactoferrin has become hot in the last 10 years, and it can cost more than $1,000 per kg, depending on the kind of purity we're talking about. So probably that price will go down as more people come in, but this is an example of where an individual protein is worth a lot more than the starting proteins, but obviously lactoferrin in cow's milk has a low concentration, so you have to do a lot of purification to get it. And I believe there will be increasing export opportunities for countries like the US. Right now, dairy exports are worth about $6 billion in 2019. And I think with the high nutritional quality of these products, I think that will help it grow into the future. And I think dairy proteins will be part of that. So lastly, I want to talk a little bit and spend a couple of minutes talking about A2 milk and discuss what it is, and then a little bit about what's the scientific evidence around some of the discussion comments around A2 milk. So the first thing I want to mention is that this word polymorphism. So all the main milk proteins have various genetic variants that you can find depending on the animal. If you go back through their genetic, trace their genetics. When we're talking about genetic variants of these proteins, these are minor amino acid differences typically. They can be just one difference in an amino acid. Most of the milk proteins we're talking about here have amino acid chain lengths that are maybe around 200 amino acids. So a genetic variant could be just one difference in one amino acid in there, and that's true for the A1 and A2 variants. These variants occurred at different types of frequencies between breeds. Some are very rare. We have found them, but they're very rare, and others are extremely common. So when we're talking about beta-casein A1 and A2, it's an amino acid polymorphism or variant. It's one amino acid out of over 200. Remember that beta-casein makes up about 30% of cow's milk, so it's not the main type of casein protein in cow's milk. Most breeds, such as Holsteins, produce a mixture naturally of A1 and A2 beta-casein. And it probably relates back to some sort of mutation that happened a long time ago. And here are examples of some of the frequencies for some of the main polymorphs of the major milk proteins. Obviously, there are other variants that I haven't talked about for beta-caseins, like the B's, C's, and D's, etc., which may or may not be found in some of these types of breeds. You can see for the Holstein and Friesian, depending on which country and which survey, you can see that it's probably somewhere maybe around 50-50 or something slightly different between A1 and A2 variant. But if you go towards the Jersey and the Guernsey, they're mostly A2. So, and Jersey and Brown Swiss have low A1 content. So it depends on the breed. What could be a potential factor talking about why people have become interested in both A1 and A2 variants of beta-casein? This change happens at the position 67 along the amino acid chain, and it changes it from proline, which is in the A2, to histidine, which is in the A1. What that means is that some potential digestion enzymes, when this casein is being digested, may or may not be able to cleave this particular small segment of the caseins. Because typically when we go consume milk, we want our digestion enzymes to chop it up, and usually it has to be chopped up into small segments, usually to get into the blood of less than 3 amino acids to be absorbed across that barrier. The idea here is that by changing that one amino acid, we can change whether or not this what is called this beta-casein fragment can be formed or not, whether it could be released. Because with proline there, it may not be released. That's the hypothesis here we're talking about. When we're talking about these kind of peptides and things, and we have a word here called beta-casein, we have to talk about a little bit about the fact that these little peptides that are released during digestion of foods and proteins are sometimes have a biological activity on their body. In other words, they act a little bit like drugs or a hormone. They stimulate some physiological function within the body. We call this bioactive peptides. So this beta-casein 7 is an exogenous opioid peptide. What that means is it elicits a response on our body. These responses can affect things like feeling of stress and pain. I would caution that the levels that are produced here are tiny compared to drug responses. These bioactive peptides potentially can affect physiological responses. And in fact, some of the more interesting ones that can be derived from things like milk and cheese are anti-hypertensive peptides. Those are ones that potentially could reduce our blood pressure or hypertension. So there's a lot of interest in looking at what could be removed and whether they have a physiological effect in our body. Back in the 1987, at a New Zealand conference, which actually I was attended, that was hosted by the International Dairy Federation, Professor Elliott proposed that this A1 was implicated in serious diseases. And at that meeting, which actually was broadcast on the evening news, there was a big news conference about it. From his epidemiological studies, he talked about the fact that based on his analysis of the type of breeds produced by cows worldwide and their association with various diseases, that there could be a risk for things like diabetes, coronary heart disease, autism, and schizophrenia. Obviously, this was big news and very serious claim and a very interesting hypothesis that was looked at. And subsequent to that, you had various books and publications and companies formed to talk about A1 and A2 milk. And here's an example of one that you may or may not have come across. And an A2 milk company was formed originally to do the genetic test to show which animals had this gene, either the A1 or A2, because they were concerned about whether it was linked to some serious illnesses. And there was highlights and books and graphs in this talking about a correlation between the high intake in A1 milk and various types of serious conditions. However, a number of significant international bodies and reviews have looked at the claims around this A1 and A2 milk. I've highlighted down in the bottom here one of those reviews, and it says this review concludes that there's no convincing or even probable evidence that the A1 beta-casein cow milk has any adverse effects on humans. And it was talking here about things like diabetes, coronary heart disease, etc. Similarly, in New Zealand and Australia, their food safety and food standard authorities also looked at these claims and also did not find that there was convincing evidence to support it. The European Food Safety Authority also got involved in this to see was there any concern about A1 milk causing any serious diseases, like some of the claims we saw there. And they published their report, an extensive report. And I just highlighted one section from their overall summary. Based on the present review of available scientific literature, a cause-effect relationship between the oral intake of this beta-casein 7 or any related peptides cannot be established. Therefore, a formal risk assessment is not recommended. So basically, they punted on this and said they didn't see any significant cause-effect type of proof that it could have a potential health impact. So if you fast forward to the launch in recent years of A2 milk here in the US, and I quote here from Greg Miller from the National Dairy Council, and basically there's still ongoing research related to A2 and A1 milk. But right now, I would say from the scientific community, it's still a theory. The more recent focus from about A2 milk is whether it helps digestion. And I would caution a couple of things as a food chemist. One is that the A1 and A2 does not affect lactose digestion, because lactose digestion is related to a lactase enzyme, and both of these milks contain the lactase enzyme, and whether or not we digest, both of these milks do not affect the amount of lactase present in the milk. That's something that's present in us, not in the milk. So I don't see that it has effect on lactose digestion. So people who have lactose digestion, this really is not related to that. It doesn't really impact allergies, because there are a variety of different caseins that can have allergic reactions, and also whey proteins in some sensitive individuals, particularly infants. And changing just one amino acid in this beta-casein A1 and A2 really isn't going to make much difference. So it's not really about lactose maldigestion, and it's not really about milk allergies. The current focus from this research is really about whether or not people tolerate the milk better, and whether it affects gut mobility and the feelings of whether or not within the stomach it's more palatable for people to drink it. And remember that this peptide that we're talking about could affect some sort of response within the body. So the real idea here is whether or not there's different levels of this peptide, and whether that affects our gut and affects gut mobility or residence time within our gut when we consume milk. And that remains to be seen. And I think there's a number of research projects that are ongoing looking at that. But whether or not this is a big factor or not, and whether it's a big factor for people to consume it or not, I don't know. All I can tell you is the original claims around things like diabetes, schizophrenia, heart disease, etc., they are no longer of major focus from the scientific community, although some research is continuing on those topics. So I'm going to pause there and thank you for your attention this morning. I hope I've walked you through a little bit about milk proteins, their properties, and also about nutrition, and ended up giving you a few thoughts from my perspective about the A2 milk. So thank you.
New research is changing everything we thought we knew about choline's impact on the cow and her calf, and top scientists have a lot to say about it. They are presenting new research that supports choline as a required nutrient to optimize milk production, choline as a required nutrient to support a healthy transition, choline as a required nutrient to improve calf health and growth, and choline as a required nutrient to increase colostrum quantity. This new research is solidifying choline's role as a required nutrient for essentially every cow, regardless of health status, milk production level, or body condition score. Learn more about the science that is changing the game and the choline source that is making it happen. Reassure precision-release choline from Balchem. Visit balchem.com/scientistsay to learn more.
Dr. Lucey, I'm going to actually ask the first question, and unfortunately I must show my age in asking it, but when I was a young child, there was a cartoon called The Jetsons, and The Jetsons took place in 2062, and so I'm going to ask you to put your creativity hat on. In 2062, what kinds of milk protein products do you believe Jane Jetson will be buying and putting in her shopping cart for George, Judy, and Elroy? Or Elrod, I think it was his name, maybe Elroy.
Well, it's an interesting question. I think I would have some thoughts. One of them is that right now, if we look at what we're breeding our animals for, it's really focused on kind of macro kind of things. Either more milk or more protein or more fat, depending on which part of the world you're focused on, and increasing health outcomes for both the calf and the cow. But let's pause a little bit and think about if you were in my shoes and you were looking at where the growth of milk and its nutritional interest is, could we instead be breeding cows for some of these minor proteins? Let's say, for example, for very high levels of lactoferrin or very high levels of some very interesting proteins that are present in milk. So I would say that if one idea about what might happen in the future is either through traditional breeding or through some other means, that the cows will not be just about producing what they normally produce, but tweaking or modifying the levels of some very interesting proteins. And then those animals and those milks would be used to custom make cows. So it's kind of like designer milk would be one terminology. And I know there's some research on this around the world. Um, Obviously, it would require making sure that the consumers are ready for that, but also it may be an opportunity for herds or for farmers to have a breed of cows that have some maybe in a safe, natural way to isolate or target cows with very high levels of some of these very minor and interesting proteins that normally in the bulk population of cows are not there. So in the future, could be that we have herds that are customized or groups of herds that are customized for a particular interesting protein. In some respects, you could say that's what kind of A2 milk is trying to do. Breed for a certain variant and then focus on a herd that can be marketed and labeled with that. But as I say, the science is not so solid, and whether there's a benefit to that. And at some point, obviously, science doesn't become important if people can market it. But I think that's maybe one opportunity. What we might see in the future is a transition of maybe not all cows, but some groups of cows are breeding for very interesting, high value or high impactful nutritional type of components. And I can think of several. Obviously, we talked about some of the proteins, but it doesn't have to be proteins. For example, the sugar profile between humans and cows is very different. And there's a lot of complicated sugars present in human milk that provides protection from infection and benefits probiotic bacteria. So again, it could be targeting cows to produce a lot more of some of those products, especially if the milk was going to be on a farm or on a herd or in a supply that was going to go, let's say, for example, into infant formula, was going to be bottled and used for that particular application. I could see that happening.
All right, very well. I've got another very interesting question for you. There was some research done in the past by USDA investigating the ability of milk protein to be used as a renewable plastic source for food packaging. Is that still viable research?
Well, I think there's two aspects to that I would like to mention. One is that before that, there was an industry focused on using these casein-based proteins for, let's call them, for nutritional purposes. If you go back around 100 years or even before that, there was actually a lot of uses for casein, the main protein we're talking about, to make buttons, to make adhesives, a lot of, and some niche applications for caseins to make a kind of natural plastic. That was work that predates the modern plastic industry to develop. And actually, the modern plastic industry really came into its own around the Second World War and beyond it. And because they could do it cheaper and they could modify it in lots of different ways, it kind of decimated the uses of casein in what I would call industrial type of uses. But now come back to today. Does that mean that you couldn't do it without? Could you go back and produce caseins to produce something like either plastics, adhesives, and other kind of materials, fibers, even for either for clothes or things like that? Yes, you could. Whether they'd be cost effective is the question, because the modern chemical plastic industry is very efficient and very adaptable to it. So, but is there another reason? I know we did some work here with the Forest Products Lab here on our campus to look at some of the adhesives for doors that were inside buildings. And one of the reasons that we were looking at them, collaborating with them between our department and them, was that caseins and soy proteins could be used. And they used less formaldehyde, which has become a topic of interest for some places like EPA in California and so others. So again, it could be some of the environmental or other kind of sustainable or renewable areas of interest that might drive some of that. One topic on renewable plastics is that there's also not just the proteins, but the sugars could be made into things like polylactic acids, and they could be made into plastics, and they could be derived from dairy wastes as well. There are some facilities that are doing that. It's pretty limited at the moment. Again, there are other ways to make the lactic acid, and this kind of lactic acid plastic has some issues in terms of broad use. And for example, unmodified, it isn't great at high temperature use. But I think both the caseins and some of the casein byproducts or co-products like permeates and lactose could be made into renewable biosources for making things like plastics. And I would anticipate, particularly on both the waste stream products, and we have a lot of like acid whey from Greek yogurt and permeates that come from these high protein concentrates. I think we'll see a lot of interest around that. And there's some companies actually, and some research actually on our campus too, exploring this topic.
Very well. When milk protein percent increases in a herd, do all milk protein fractions increase proportionally?
Yeah, that's a great question. Overall, we don't sometimes know that. I think sometimes what happens is that based on the genetics or feed, that the overall proteins will go up in total amounts. But I don't know if we know for sure about all the minor proteins. For example, we can have some change in the ratios of some caseins and whey proteins, even just during a single lactation, where, for example, I grew up in Ireland, as I mentioned, you could see lactational shifts as well. So I think we don't know for sure, but I think in general, all things will increase if we increase the amount of protein produced in an animal. But we are always interested, and there are people studying whether that changes some of the profile. And it could.
All right, thank you for that. I've gotten a few questions related to alternatives to milk protein, whether it be soy or almonds. And so here's an opportunity to make the case why milk protein is far superior to those products.
Well, a couple of things to bear in mind. I mentioned the branched chain amino acids, and caseins and whey proteins are very high in the branched chain amino acids, higher than soy, which actually is a very high quality protein too, I have to say. But certainly true from a lot of the other plant proteins. Soy is the kind of king of some of these plant proteins and has been competing with dairy for decades on terms of some of these. But you also have to step back and think about what's present in milk. Milk is a unique material produced to be the sole food of the young calf or human, depending on which milk we're talking about. So it is an extraordinarily complicated material. The caseins, the structures we saw this morning are extremely complicated materials. The proteins are complicated, the fat structures are complicated. They're all complicated because they're designed by nature for nutrition. And just adding some calcium and some protein and fortifying some beverage products doesn't make and match what we have designed by nature over millennia. That's one thing we have to watch out for. And maybe people aren't paying attention and just saying, well, it's got a certain amount of protein, certain amount of minerals. We don't know about their bioavailability or their quality. Many of the plant proteins, the quality of the protein is not as good as the main dairy proteins. What that means is it lacks one of the essential amino acids. And that means that you don't get the full value of that protein. It might say on the label that it's got 5, 6, 7 grams of protein, but you may not be able to use all of that protein. So that's what I was talking about earlier on. The quality of protein is important, but sometimes on our packages, it doesn't tell about the quality. And consumers maybe are not all as aware of the quality of protein. So I think if you look at the complexity, it's designed by nature for a nutritional purpose. And the fact that it contains so many other materials, whether it's the minerals or vitamins or other kind of nutritional products, I think it's very hard to replicate milk. If you also step back and think about, we don't need to go in the lab to make this milk. We just feed the cow and we can milk her in a few hours' time and she produces it already made within our own factories, within our mammary cells of the cow. I find it hard to believe that it will be easy to mass produce milk in the lab. It certainly is easy to mass produce high value proteins in the lab. because they have high value, and it bears the cost of growing up, fermenting, and isolating in the lab because it's a high value ingredient. I get that. We're already doing it with things like rennet, the enzyme used in making cheese. But so I would say that would be my perspective.
On behalf of Balchem and Dr. Lucey, thank you for joining us today.
We'd love to hear your comments or ideas for topics and guests, so please reach out via email at anh.marketing@balchem.com with any suggestions, and we'll work hard to add them to the schedule. Don't forget to leave a 5-star rating on your way out. You can request your Real Science Exchange t-shirt in just a few easy steps. Just like or subscribe to the Real Science Exchange and send us a screenshot along with your address and t-shirt size to anh.marketing@balchem.com. Balchem's Real Science Lecture Series of webinars takes place on the first Tuesday of every month, with the top research and nutrition topics that will impact your business. We also include small ruminant, monogastric, and companion animal-focused topics throughout the year. Visit balchem.com/realscience to see the upcoming topics and to register for future webinars. You can also access past webinars and search for the topics most important to you.